Thanks for coming out tonight. This is the first event in what's going to be the Bush School's What's Next series. Tonight we're going to be discussing Hurricane Harvey, the road to recovery. Occasionally throughout the semester, as there are big events either domestically or internationally, we'll be planning events like this. And so check your emails for further events or the Bush School Facebook page. So we're going to start I'm going to give a little bit of just basic background information about Hurricane Harvey and some of the damage that was done. Then I'll introduce our three distinguished panelists here, and then I'll turn it over to them. They have about 10 minutes apiece of information they'd like to share with you, and then we're going to open up to questions. So be thinking about some questions that we can answer for you. All right? So Hurricane Harvey, as a lot of you were probably personally affected by, was a catastrophic and extremely destructive Atlantic hurricane. In a 4-day period, many areas received more than 40 inches of rain as the system meandered over eastern Texas and adjacent waters, causing catastrophic flooding, with peak accumulations just over 50 inches. Resulting floods inundated hundreds of thousands of homes, displaced more than 30,000 people, and prompted more than 17,000 rescues. On September 3rd, Texas State Governor Greg Abbott estimated that the damages will be between $150 billion to $180 billion, and if those numbers pan out to be correct, that's the most damaging hurricane on record. The floodwaters contain a number of hazards to the environment and human health. The Houston Health Department stated that millions of contaminants were present in floodwaters. These include E. coli and coliform bacteria. Measurements of colony-forming units showed that concentrations were so high there were a risk of contracting flesh-eating disease from the water. Houston officials stated that the Houston drinking water and sewer systems were intact. However, hundreds of thousands of people across the 38 Texas counties affected by Hurricane Harvey using private wells, according to an estimate by LSU researchers, that those people are going to have to fend for themselves in the meantime. Additionally, Harris County, which includes Houston, contains a large number of Superfund designed brownfield sites that contain a wide variety of toxins and carcinogens, and 2 Superfund sites in Corpus Christi were flooded. So now begins the road to recovery for Texas. Tonight we have 3 Bush School experts, as I already alluded to talk with us. To my right here, in the first chair next to me, is Dr. Danny Davis. Danny is a senior lecturer at the Bush School. He's the coordinator of the Executive Masters in Public Service Administration and the director of the Graduate Certificate in Homeland Security. To the right of him is Dr. David Mcintyre, who's a lecturer at the Bush School of Government and Public Service. Dave has been writing, teaching, and presenting on national security and homeland security issues for 30 years. He's taught for 20 semesters at the Bush School and is a fellow at the Center for Cyber and Homeland Security at George Washington University. To the right of him is Professor Ron Siebert. Ron is a senior lecturer and director of the Certificate in Advanced International Affairs program. It's a mouthful. All right, to that, I will go ahead and turn it over to our panelists, and we'll go from there.
Good evening. You say that to a room full of Aggies, they don't know what you're saying for the next 15 minutes. No, it's good to be with y'all today. There's our agenda right quick. My job tonight is to kind of set the tone of how the United States, the state, and the locals set up to and organize to respond to and respond and recover from disasters. Homeland Security. That's all right. Emergency management, you see it's a managerial function, and that's what its purpose is. So it's designed to protect communities, coordinating, integrating all the different activities, local, state, in some cases tribal, and all in the federal level jurisdictions. That's what it's all about. Okay, the Department of Homeland Security, which you all know has been around since about 2002 after the 9/11 attacks, has 5 missions. Here's 2 and 2 more. And then the one that we're concerned with, ensuring resilience to disasters. That can be a natural disaster or that can be a man-made disaster. Guiding documents that Department of Homeland Security puts out. Here you've got the strategy. Comes out about every 4 years. You got the National Response Framework, which lays out the foundation of all this response recovery business. The National Incident Management System, that's the document that establishes a framework or a foundation upon which local, state, or federal organizations, departments, agencies can organize their activities. And then the national preparedness goals is just what that is. They set goals at the national level, and then the states, locals, try to live up to those goals along with the feds. And finally, what we're really concerned with, the National Disaster Recovery Framework. This is integrated with the other 4 documents that I showed you, and it does just what we're talking about, disaster recovery. That's what it governs, those things. The quote down there at the bottom, all disasters are local, that comes from the National Response Framework, and that is the idea that it's the local elected official or responsible official that's responsible during in Harris County, the county judge. Brazos County, the county judge. In Houston, the mayor of Houston. So, but that's who controls. You know, you might see sometime a FEMA official get up in front of the camera. Back during Katrina, you saw General Honore get up. He wasn't in charge. They were all answering to that local official, whoever that was, as to what the needs of the response and the recovery were. Real quick, there's a disaster. Doesn't matter what kind. Next. Those are the people that show up, the first responders. Well, obviously, especially in a situation like we just got through with Harvey, a lot of those people can't show up, can they? They're victims too. So when that happens, when the local area is overwhelmed by the disaster, the state comes in. The state ops center is up in Austin. They set up, they're running, they're coordinating with the different EOCs at the different counties. For this disaster, there were 46 counties affected. 46 counties. Whole lot of people, whole lot of critical infrastructure, etc. So you've got the state, the DPS, all the different assets that the state has. From there, if he needs the National Guard, the governor can use state active duty, and the state guard stands up. And as you know, one of the things that went real well this time, the governor didn't stay back. As we used to say in the Army, he was leaning forward in the foxhole. He was ready, and before the flooding started, he already had assets, including the National Guard, that were congregating, getting ready to respond. If we have something called Emergency Management Assistance Compacts, and those are agreements between the different states. So if, for example, that was good. He was supposed to catch that. Okay. If for example the state needs electric power, then maybe Oklahoma, they have one of these EMAC agreements with Oklahoma, between Texas and Oklahoma. They're able to call for those linemen to be able to come down and help in Texas. So that's state to state. Excuse me. If the state's overwhelmed, go ahead. Next one. Then that's when the request for federal assistance goes, the governor to the president. The 23rd is when the governor asked for a federal declaration. The 25th is when President Trump approved it. So again, both the state and the federal government were leaning forward, getting ready for this disaster that everybody knew was coming. In this case, the Department of Homeland Security is the lead federal agency. As soon as that happens, they set up a joint field office. In this case, they co-located up at the State Operations Center in Austin. So the feds and the state are working right there together. Next one. In the big disaster like the one we just had, FEMA, or the DHS with FEMA as the lead agency, they're able to request assistance from other federal departments and agencies. In this case, as you see on the slide, they go to DOD, Department of Defense. DOD is the big gorilla in the thing, and a lot of people think that the DOD shows up and everything's fine. That's not necessarily the case. DOD is slow and it costs a lot of money, and you always got to keep that in the back of your minds. But at any rate, DOD pitches in. When that happens, U.S. Northern Command up in Colorado, they are the combatant command that responds, or that's responsible for the homeland. So they get the call. they send a defense coordinating officer who's a colonel or maybe a colonel in the Army or the Marine Corps or Air Force, captain in the Navy. That DCO goes to the Joint Field Office, and then he's working hand in hand with the FEMA people and the state people. That's how all the DoD requirements flow through that defense coordinating officer back to NORTHCOM through the Pentagon and get approval and then are able to deploy. Okay. National Preparedness Goal, you saw that was one of the documents that we looked at just a while ago. There's also something called Presidential Policy Directive 8, National Preparedness. Those are the, you see the 5 things there: prevention, protection, mitigation, response, which is what we're talking about tonight, and recovery, which we're also going to talk about tonight, Dave especially. So that's the National Preparedness Goal. Go ahead. National Disaster Recovery Framework. Here are some core principles. You can see it starts at the very lowest level with individuals and families, leadership, local control, pre-disaster recovery planning, partnerships, inclusiveness, public information. Hit it one more time. Unity of effort. Unity of effort's a big deal in the Army or the Air Force. We call that chain of command. In the civilian world, it's more of there's somebody that's in charge of each piece of this response or recovery. And that person, sometimes force of personality might take over a little bit in these meetings, but for the most part, everybody knows who's in charge of what. And that's what unity of effort is all about in this business. Timeliness and flexibility, obviously. And you see the final 2 there. But that's in a very, I spend a semester talking about all the things that I just covered in 8 minutes.
You're good.
Okay.
Came in under your 10-minute mark.
Recovery mission, there it is. Support communities in rebuilding. Again, individuals, civic institutions, businesses, governmental organizations can function on their own, return to normal life. That's the goal, as quickly as possible to get to that stage. Okay.
Thanks, Danny.
Before Professor McIntyre talks, I have to say I wish it always operated as smooth as Danny just made it sound. It does not. When he gets to me as the lawyer, you'll hear. But anyway, go ahead.
So I'll see if I can watch my time pretty close. Let me begin with some congratulations. Credit where credit is due. We have a number of folks in the audience this evening that actually work emergency management issues. Bob Yangesidis is here, who's with Office of Emergency Management down in Harris County. Jason Motes is here with TEECS. Let me tell you, I've been following this since 1997. And this is the smoothest, from an external view, the smoothest operation I have ever seen for a major problem like this. Now, that does not mean it was smooth. I talked to these guys offline. They will tell you somebody's not there at the right time, somebody's out of food. That's what they get paid for. It's a constant crisis. But the progress that has been made in the last 15 years or so is just extraordinary. And that credit goes to these folks in emergency management who have been in the deep water fighting the snakes, loading the boats, not to those of us who are teaching policy. And I want to invite them this evening when you get to Q&A. If you got something that you want to contribute, please raise your hand and do so. But we're going to focus on the policy end of things. What I'm going to talk about is the issue of recovery, and I'm going to start with who's in charge. And I'm going to tell you what my students always struggle with, especially my military students, and the answer to that question. Now we're looking at the recovery. This is the hard, brutal, long-term, very expensive part. When there are lives on the line, everybody pitches in. When it's hot and sweaty and it's been 3 months, it's a different deal to get somebody off from work to come help you sort out your business. So who is in charge? And the problem my students always have a hard time believing is the answer is nobody is in charge. Nobody's, the mayor may be responsible for some things, the governor may be responsible for some things, the county judge may be responsible for some. There is no one overall person in charge of all aspects of recovery. Now, at one point in our national history, there was one person responsible for all government activities at every level. His name was King George. We got rid of him. We no longer have that system. And because of that, this responsibility is spread across many jurisdictions, right down to individuals who are now responsible for figuring out their own recovery in lots of ways. So please keep that in mind. Let's go now to the slide, and I want to stand up so I can see it. This is from the New York Times. It's the best map I've been able to find of Houston as a whole. So if you know Houston, we are off the map up here in the north somewhere.
Dan, you
where,
have a hard copy of
Highway
that?
290
Got a
runs
hard copy?
way on up here. 290 runs here and then up to 6. So we're way on up there somewhere. This is the Addicks Reservoir, the Barker Reservoir, and these lines here converge on the city of center of Houston, which is right about here. And those red lines run right over here to the Houston Ship Channel where they dump out. This is Buffalo Bayou running right through here. This is Cypress. If you go from Houston down 6 to 290, you run right through Cypress. And you can see where the creeks were and where the flooding was. Here's the point. The pink represents flooded buildings within a flood zone. That's where people knew they had a problem and bought insurance. The red dots represent where it's not flooded before. You are not required to have insurance. Frequently, it's not even available. Most private companies don't sell it. You probably have to buy it from the federal government. And as a result, they don't sell it everywhere. And by the way, it's $28 billion in the red right now, the federal flood program is. So you can see the difference between the pink dots, where people are likely to have insurance, and the red, where they are likely not to. So look at these reservoirs. Let's see the next slide. Yeah, 40% of the buildings estimated by the Federal Emergency Management Agency to be flooded in Harris County and areas considered a minimal flood hazard. Next one, please, sir. Some calculations, current flooding represents the third 500-year flood in Houston in the past 3 years. Next, please. So this sign, if you can't see it, says Addicks Reservoir. I showed you the location of Addicks down there if you don't know the Houston area. So see where the reservoir is? You see a reservoir? Yeah, there's no reservoir. The Addicks Reservoir is empty. In fact, that spot right there is a golf course. The water line, this was taken 2 weeks after the storm, last Sunday. On Sunday of the storm, the water line was above that sign right there. In an area that is normally completely dry, a huge area completely, it's just a wetlands that absorbs. This is across the street from that, and that's the water line, where the water line was. Next one, please. This is a sort of a barrier that's about 8-10 feet high. That's the limit of the Barker Reservoir in the north, and water was up over that and way back into the neighborhoods in here. This is on the northern side, right by Highway 10. This is the Texas Children's Hospital. This is where a bunch of new construction is going in. And see that circle right there? It says Addicks Cullen Park. You can build your building right next to the park. Well, the park is the reservoir. Except it's normally empty of water, except during these 500-year floods, which have been 3 times in the last 3 years. So you begin to get a feel for the scope of the problem and why we have a problem. Houston's, all this area, by the way, I was born and raised in Houston. I used to come visit up in Grimes County. We would have come up 290, which was a 2-lane road, and the only lights on 290 were flashing yellow lights. And all of this area was rice fields because it's flat and it's wet. And now it is all cement. And the question is where the water goes when it rains. Next, please. Well, here's where it goes. This is, remember where the Addicks sign was? If you turn 180 degrees and you go 1 block, this is people's lives. And it goes on for a mile on both sides of the neighborhood. It's everything in those houses, gutted and in the street. Next slide. Well, let's go back one. Something's out of order here. Let's go back and stay on those others, those pictures. So here's the problem that they run into. Just a quick problem of understanding what we mean by recovery. So if you had a $200,000 house right there, and you put $40,000 down, if you haven't bought a house before, you may not understand this. Put $40,000 down, you begin paying into the payments, and you got a 30-year loan. The thing you pay off first is the loan. So if you've been paying for 10 years, you've actually paid a relatively small amount of that money back. What you've paid is the interest. If that house is flooded and you have no insurance, and the house is condemned, which frequently happens and has to be knocked down, not only have you lost all your goods, but there's nothing to sell. You're out the $40,000 and you still owe the loan. The loan doesn't go away. So who do you pay? How do you pay that loan? And then where do you live? This is sort of scratching the surface of what we're talking about when we talk about recovery. Real quick, I only got about 4 minutes left. Usually we talk about critical infrastructure and disasters like that. That's chemical plants and water and lights and so forth. Here we had a very unusual event where most of that stayed on and most of that was not a major problem. But that doesn't mean the users are in good shape. I took a student group down to Galveston after Hurricane Ike, and we took a look at what happened there, and the lights came back on, and the power went right to the street lights. But the vendors in the stores still could not turn on the lights and couldn't use a charge card. And the reason is because the power may come to the green box at the corner, but that doesn't mean that your wiring has been inspected. So you have to rip out the walls, replace the wiring, and you have to have an inspector. And you may bring an electrical company from electrical guys from Alabama to fix the power line, but you can't bring an inspector from Alabama to look at Houston codes. So this business of recovery is a long, painful effort where you have to look at the individual details. Local jurisdictions. We don't ever talk about critical infrastructure in terms of local jurisdictions, but it's not just Houston and Harris County. Addicts, everyone, Magnolia, all these little towns have their own responsibilities for police and fire and water and animal control and schools, and all those things have to be rebuilt. And the question in all of this is, who's going to pay for that, and where's the money going to come from? There's a question of cross-jurisdictional coordination. During emergencies, the jurisdictions coordinate pretty well together now. But now, from here on out, every jurisdiction on the map is in competition for resources. They are all in competition for state money and federal money and all kinds of grants. And so that makes it a little tougher for them to coordinate as well as they did when they were trying to save people from the flood. Companies have business continuity problems. If you were flooded out and you didn't have flood insurance, then how you serve your customer base and stood back up in time to save your customers from going to somebody else is a huge challenge. And there's no playbook for most companies if they haven't worked that ahead of time. Now, some companies did a very good job. The company my son works for produces oil rigs, and they took their call list company-wide. They called every employee, said who has a problem with their house, and then they built teams from the people that build oil rigs, and they gave them time on company time to go help their employees in their house. That is a business continuity plan that really matters and really works. Most companies didn't do that, and most small businesses that are flooded out, they're going to fail. They think insurance is the answer, and that it's not enough. So let me jump forward, and then we'll do Q&As in just a second. Let me tell you the biggest single problem or question that's going to emerge is the question of who pays. Somebody's got to pay for all of this, and what's the city of Houston's biggest problem? Their biggest problem is not going to be rebuilding this. Their biggest problem, I think, is going to be everywhere there's a red dot. That's their tax base. If those homes are flooded and those people are bankrupt and they don't have a place to work, then how do they contribute to the tax base for the city to recover? And we can address some other areas when we get to the Q&A. I think that's good enough for this session right now. But I hope you get the point. Complexity, the coordination period or cooperation period is over, and now we're facing a very long year, 2, 3 years of brutal effort for people who have lost everything, and we're not sure exactly who's going to pay for making them whole. Sir.
Ron.
Okay. Both these folks here could have talked easily for an hour without notes, but we all agreed to try to keep our comments to about 10 minutes because we really wanted to leave the rest of the time for your questions of the other 30 minutes or 25 minutes. I'm the lawyer here. I'm not a civil lawyer. I'm actually national security law lawyer and international law, but I know a few things about this, and I'll tell you what I do know, and we can go from there. It seems to me the essence of this program is where do we go from here? And as a lawyer, I see a number of key developments, unfortunately, one of which will just make lawyers rich. Not me. I work for Texas A&M, but will make a number rich. And the reason is of the thousands of lawsuits we're going to have now. And these lawsuits are going to be against the Corps of Engineers for those reservoirs. It's going to be against whoever operates those levees and built them. It's going to be whoever maintains the Buffalo Bayou. And I just picked up from Danny's comment, now it's going to be against the Superfund sites and whoever controls them. All of these lawsuits come as a spin-off from Katrina lawsuits. The way it works basically, for years you could not sue the government. The government was the king, you couldn't sue the government. In the 50s and 60s, we passed legislation called the Federal Tort Claims Act, which was passed, supplemented by the Texas Tort Claims Act, and also applies to Harris County as well. And they basically, these acts says, Well, generally you can't sue the government, but you can sue the government if they're negligent. Well, these provisions, people went after the government for negligence in some cases, but there was an exception where the government still had immunity. And it was called if the government took an act that was, quote, unquote, a discretionary function. So, what happened after Katrina? In 2004 to 2015, there were thousands of lawsuits from people in New Orleans who were flooded when the levees broke north of New Orleans. And they sued the Corps of Engineers, and every one of them lost. And the reason they lost is because the court said it was a discretionary function as to how you build the levees and where you build the levees. And by the way, another normally discretionary function would be, do you release water from these Addicks reservoirs or not? Okay? However, in 2015, in a very novel legal theory, the Federal Court of Claims for the first time allowed lawsuits by the Katrina victims on the basis that it was the destruction of the levees was a taking of property without just compensation and without due process. Brand new theory, sounds interesting. They won. They won. Well, that, and I hate to use the term, but that opened the floodgates for Katrina lawsuits, and it's going to open the floodgates for lawsuits on Harvey. Now, that gets to the key question, which Professor Mcintyre was just referring to, is like, you keep wondering, who's going to pay for these people who are not insured? Well, these people who are not insured are going to be going after the federal government and the state government, at least if you're downwind or down water from those reservoirs. The others, I don't know. I keep wondering, how are they going to pay? I just don't know. But there's going to be a lot of lawsuits to try to get that money from those who are not insured. All right, second area I want to address from a legal standpoint. I don't know, thrilled, maybe thrilled is the word. I just thought it was great when Harvey came along, and on the second day, the city manager or the police chief came out and says, if you can help us, come. I thought it was terrific. And that unleashed all these people with everybody with a boat and 50 miles coming to help. That was great. So different than every other disaster we've had. Wouldn't that have been nice in New Orleans? We never had that because the general position of the government has always been, you dumb citizens, you just stay in place and the government will take care of everything. And then everything turns to crap and then everybody's crying whines about the government, right? So they asked for help. I thought that was terrific. And they got the help. But as a lawyer, I'm thinking, could this be a new standard for the future? But then as a lawyer, I had to think, wait a minute. What happens if these civilians who are responding, what if one of them gets hurt? What if they hurt somebody else? I remember watching some of these people picking up people in boats, and I'd immediately look at that outboard motor, and I'd see that outboard motor churning while people were walking up to the boat, and I was like, oh my God, somebody's going to get cut, and it's going to be serious. What happens if you rush as a volunteer to help and someone gets hurt? Well, in Texas, we do have a Good Samaritan law, and it will protect you if you're negligent, but it will not protect you if you're blatantly negligent. Now you're saying, what's blatant negligence, what's negligent? That depends on what the jury says when they hear all the facts. So on one hand, I was really excited about this, but on the other hand, we have to recognize there's potential problems. Third and last area I want to talk about before we open up for questions. Hopefully a little bit more upbeat, but we need to look and examine the National Response Plan and National Incident Management System that the previous speakers have referred to. It was established by the Homeland Security. These were established by the Homeland Security Act of 2004. They did not work in Katrina. They hadn't been in place very long. They did not work with the oil spill. Part of the reason they did not work is they hadn't been in place very long, but part of the reason they didn't really work is people seem to expect that the federal government was going to do everything. Where's George Bush in the Army? It's almost like George Bush was supposed to be out there with a rowboat, rescuing people. And when they had the oil spill, they were on Barack Obama. It was like he's supposed to be out there with a saw sucking up the oil. A straw sucking up the oil. It was silly. But everybody expected the federal government to do everything. Well, as the NRP and NIMS say, and as these gentlemen have explained, the way the system is set up is local first, then city to state, then if the state is overwhelmed, it's state to state with these interstate compacts. It's not the federal government. When you need resources, you then, if the president under the Stafford Act says, okay, I'll declare an emergency in the area, a disaster area or an emergency, then you can go to FEMA and say, FEMA, help me with resources that you can bring in from around the country. But this is the state coordinated, it's local, state, and state to state first. Yeah, you can send in a Coast Guard, and they have been really helped. We can't send in the Army right away. Under the Title X statutes, there's only very few exceptions. One of them is when the governor asked for the Army. What happened in Louisiana was President Bush said to the governor, will you please ask me and I will send in the Army to help. The governor refused. Things turned to junk and they all blamed President Bush, but the governor wouldn't ask. All right. After Katrina, we had the Post-Katrina Act. It did a couple of really good things. One was under the Stafford Act now, the president can declare an emergency even before the hurricane hits and make resources pre-positioned and available. And we saw President Trump do that. And it worked to a large extent. Two, this act strengthened FEMA. After Katrina, they're saying, get rid of FEMA. They're a bunch of yokels. They don't know what they're doing. Fact is, they strengthened FEMA, better training, better people, better organization, and it raised FEMA in the federal government bureaucracy. FEMA can even check with criminal records of people going to shelters. They can have that checked out. They can do a national center for identification where people are, a national integration center. And FEMA is charged with trying to instruct and train people on this NRP and NIMS. Now that raises the key question I want to talk about that. The basic question I have always asked after Katrina and after a number of other things is who is in charge? Danny, could you have pull up that slide? I've always said, who is in charge? Who really is in charge? And this is what I think is a problem with the National Incident Management System. So we set this system up, and this is called the Unified Coordination Group, and here every agency that has an interest is there. It doesn't reflect that, but like saying the oil spill, or in Katrina and now in Harvey, you have environmental protection. EPA is there. DOD is there. Okay? State National Guard is there. State law enforcement is there. Federal law enforcement is there. Health and Human Services is there. You name an agency that might have an interest, and they're there. Now, who's the leader? This is called, actually, when Danny did this chart, he knocked out the very top line. The top line says Unified Command. And those of you who have military training know that Unified Command means no command. It's not one. All these people have a voice. So who is in charge? This is the problem we have with NIMS. Now let me tell you how it might have played out here in Harvey. And what I'm thinking that we have to look at down the road is exactly how these decisions played out and how NIMS worked. But this is why I've always raised the question about Unified Command. All right, in Harvey, we had a question. Should we release the water from the reservoirs? Right? Now think about yourself. I don't know what happened. It'll be interesting to see. You're in this Unified Coordination Group. The Corps of Engineers says, guys, I've got to release the water or the dams are going to break. And everybody gets flooded by rushing water. But the mayor might have said, I don't know, but you can imagine a situation where the mayor says, if you release the water, you're going to flood all those people in attics who haven't been flooded. That's where those pictures were taken. So who wins? Corps of Engineers or the mayor? Well, we got this beautiful Unified Command. Who makes the decision? Right? What about evacuation? What if the governor says, I think you guys need to evacuate, evacuate. Right? I'm the governor's office, I'm part of this. And what if the mayor says, no, I'm not evacuating because it'll be worse? Who wins? Who makes the decision? This is one of the things I want to see going forward. I want to see an examination of the NIMS and NRP and see how it worked. Because when you listen to Danny, everything was just so wonderful and fluid. And that's the way it's supposed to work. But you know and I know that someplace, there must have been debate about evacuation or not evacuation, right? Release the water from those dams or not release the water. And you can picture any one of 100 situations. And when they had the oil spill, Fish and Wildlife was out there saying, don't put this in the water to kill the oil. Then Coast Guard would come and say, no, put that in the water to destroy the oil. And then EPA would say, no, don't do that. And I remember the governor of Mississippi came out, what is this unified command? I got 3 different things. What do we do? So it'll be interesting to see, and we need to examine this. Okay? So now we'll hear your questions. Yeah. Thanks.
So what I'd like to do is, if you have a question, just like you're in class, raise your hand, and I'll call on you. And you can either stand and tell us your name and ask your question. You can direct it to the panel or any individual if you like. So a quick hand on the very back.
So the flood insurance program is set up last week to assist folks in areas that may be flooded. You know, there's some tragedies that come, and it's like kind of framework where it allowed people to build in areas where they shouldn't build, you know, and people who can afford to build, you know, really nice places on coastal areas, you know, allow them to have some type of insurance. Now that we've moved forward, how many times should the federal government pay for flood insurance for these places that have been repeatedly flooded out? How do they unwind this program, basically?
Well, there actually is a limit on the number of times they'll pay out. So if you've been flooded, and I've forgotten whether it's 2 times or 3 times, but I've talked to people in the last week who had to sell and move from previous storms because they'd been flooded a couple of times before. And can't, Jason, you had Bob, correct? But having said that, there are several pieces to the National Flood Insurance Program, and what I'd recommend is go home and take a look at a Frontline PBS program about Hurricane Sandy and the flood insurance program in New Jersey. It is an eye-opener about the complications of this program. The idea is we want to promote the economy. So sure, we could say nobody build on the coastline because, you know, suck it up when there's a storm. Nobody's, you know, USA is not going to insure there, no private insurance, so do without. Well, that doesn't feed the state economy. That doesn't feed the Galveston economy. So there's a vested interest in saying, let's have some kind of program to support the people. But an insurance program, guess what? You have to pay for the insurance. Well, Congress over the years has put a damper on how much they require people to pay. So the payments into the flood insurance program, if you have flood insurance, don't cover the actual claims when a flood takes place. This is why it's $28 billion in the red before these 2 storms started. So now we have a question that bumps up every time against this debt limit. Are we going to renew the program? Are we going to expand the program? And what about the people who weren't in it? Remember, a lot of these people are not in flood areas. Now, the idea of a national flood insurance program, among other things, if you want a federally backed mortgage and you're in a floodplain, you have to buy the insurance. But what about those folks across the street from the Addicks Dam? I mean, there hasn't been water there since I was a kid, and that was a long time ago. There's been no water there. And all of a sudden, it's 9 feet deep in their house. Whose fault was that? So who's going to make them whole? So the answer is there are limits to how many times you can be flooded out and get paid off. But that's not the big question. The big question is, how about people who are flooded out, didn't even have the chance to buy flood insurance, now what?
Thank you.
So we have these great emergency manager professors, and I'm going to ask a question about education. So one of the things that people talk about is the need to open up public schools soon after an emergency situation. Can you speak about that a little bit and why that is important, especially after natural disasters?
So why is it's important to open up public schools
To get them back open.
Oh, to get them back open. Well, I mean, you know, providing education for the youngsters, for the population, that's one of the principal reasons for government, you know. That's like when having a court, having law enforcement work, having a court that's in session. You know, when you start having things like that aren't working, society stops to some extent. So that's why I think it's so important to get things. You know, the other part of it is, when your kid gets to the point where it's going to school, she or he is going to school. I don't guess I should say it. When that kid's in school for 6 hours a day, what can the parents do? The parents can be at work. If that kid's not in school, somebody's got to take care of that child. So I think that's kind of an ancillary part of it also.
Jason?
Danny, there's another portion to this too, and this push came out probably starting in the mid-'80s and has progressively grown, which is there's a psychological aspect of it. You're getting kids back into the routine that they're used to. So you're getting them back into school, you're getting them in there, they can get free meals, and didn't they provide free meals throughout all of Harris County?
City of Houston for the rest of the year is providing.
Yeah. So they're at least getting meals and stuff like that. And so even if the parents aren't going back to work, they're able to work on the house and take care of things. And the kids have some sense of routine. Mm-hmm. It's a psychological matter as much as it is.
And that's the last point over there for the principles of recovery.
The other issue to think about too is the strain it puts on neighboring districts, right? So what a lot of people do is then go enroll their children in other districts, and then that puts additional strain on the resources in those communities as well. Again, highlights the importance of doing this quickly.
So do you want to comment on that, or did you have questions?
Another question.
Okay, one quick point about that, just for clarification. When you move from recovery to response, when you move from response to recovery, largely the emergency manager's job is done. The emergency manager handles emergencies. The recovery, this long-term 2-year, 3-year process of rebuilding, that is not handled by the Office of the Emergency Manager. Now, he is obviously engaged in all of this, right? You're going to be a busy boy for the next couple of years. But the emergency managers are, fire, police, they are not charged with this recovery business, this rebuilding part. And every storm is different in who's going to be charged with that. There is no set organization. There's no set model. It's going to be different in Harris County than it's going to be in Houston. It's going to be different there than it's going to be in Addicts. And so this is one of the issues, is it really is locally driven. The last point on schools is there's so many threads to this. For example, in most places you get a federal dollar for every hour that a student puts their behind in the seat, right? If the school is not open and the students are not there, then you don't get those federal dollars. If you don't get those federal dollars, then the teachers go without pay. So there's an interruption to the entire cycle. So the schools, the grocery stores, the fire, the police, flushing toilets, water that comes out and then you can drink. There's like this half dozen things you gotta have to begin re-inhabiting a location. Fortunately, in most of Houston's going to be okay in that regard. It's these flooded areas that have got a serious problem.
Quick question, on the firm maps that FEMA uses, how do you think that will change over the next few years? Because right now, basically the formula is 100-year flood is 1% chance of it happening. There's no real science behind the way they develop that. Do you think this will be an eye-opener?
That's a good question. I would think they would go back in light of the history that's happened. I mean, how did they know when they'd say 500-year floodplain? I don't think anybody was keeping records there back then. Yeah.
They're going to have to reevaluate anyway.
Yeah.
So I was at Mount Pinatubo when we had to close Clark Air Base. And I was there with the volcanologist and the hydrologist, and we looked at why we're closing the air base. And they laid out this map. And they said, look here's the pyroclastic flows, and you can see where this elevation line is. Well, that's the flow of 1642. And here's the flow of 1735. And here's the flow of 1846. And you know why we have a big flat area here for you to build a runway, Clark Air Force Base? Because it was a pyroclastic flow, and it's going to happen again sometime. So you can get those elevations. The problem in a place like Houston is not the elevation. The problem is the cement. So that FEMA's map may be accurate before the last 10 years of construction. Now what? And I don't think anybody knows.
Piggybacking off of that, there's a lot more construction of these areas been growing a lot lately, and there's a big strain on housing already. There's already a big strain before, so now you have the people who are trying to move into the area and doing it. So how are they planning to protect these areas now? And with all this construction that's supposed to come on and the rebuilding that's going on. Dennis, under the table.
There's a big fight about this. You guys don't live in Houston, so you don't listen to the radio down there. If you listen to the NPR station down there, they have something on this about once a week before the storm. There's a big fight about West Houston, and there are areas that are trying to be reserved for wetlands and to absorb water and so forth. This is going to get even worse because it's a clash of legal issues. Property owner owns the property. You telling me he can't sell? Because you think at some point in the future there might be a flood, so you're going to, now we get to the illegal taking. And that's what he was talking about, the illegal taking. Wait a minute, my family's owned this area as a rice farm. We owned this for 150 years, and now we can make some money by selling it to be able to expand the children's hospital. And you're telling me no, because you are worried about people 4 miles from here on Buffalo Bio when I pour the cement for the parking lot. So we got a very interesting legal challenge, right?
Yeah, that's fascinating. As I was thinking about your question. Yeah, as a city planner, I guess I would want some of those rice fields, wide open land to absorb flooding or whatever. And as he's saying, what about if you own that land, you'd want to make $1 million selling it for the housing development?
Remember,
right?
that land is not in Houston. So Katy wants the tax base. Addicts wants the tax base. Cypress wants the tax base. It's Houston that wants them not to build so the water will be absorbed. You get the problem we have? So now welcome to the policy end of our world. This is why the policy is so complicated.
So I've been on a couple of trips doing humanitarian efforts abroad and within the United States. And from listening to your presentation and the map, I really appreciated it because you can observe where the issues really are and then analyze. But it seems that you don't have communication or organization to do anything about it, but you're in a very nice spot right now because the spotlight is on Houston. Everyone's heart is going out to Houston. We have beat the hell out of Harvey. So with all this aid and effort going towards Houston, what's really being used for that? Like, where is it going? Is it being spread evenly? Is it focused on, the high areas that taxpayers care about? Like, what is the best thing for us?
That's I was thinking about, who is he? The football player from Texas. Yeah, how much has he raised now? How does that get to where it needs to go? Who is he going to do that? Is he going to set up an agency to do that himself? Is he going to do it through the Red Cross or Samaritan's Purse or what? I don't know. It's a good question. I mean, there's a whole lot. Willie Nelson, I think, is giving a concert as we speak. Where's all that money? How's it going to get to where it belongs? I don't know the answer to the question.
This is such a weird. Bob and Jason were talking before. Professional emergency managers and TEEX. By the way, I didn't mention TEEX to begin with. They are literally a world leader in the actual execution of this. So let me make sure they get the credit here. I mean, I'm just a policy guy, but this is such a weird storm. In New Orleans, the people who got the worst of it were the poorest, because that's where the levee broke. Here, if you know Houston, the people that were flooded, who lives along the bayous? That's where the money is. That's where the upper middle class wants to live, because it's parks and it's golf courses and it's country clubs, because sometimes it floods. And so now what you have is that you've threatened the tax base. So it's going to be very interesting to see how the money is allocated if you live in a $500,000 home and it's gone, you've got a problem. And you got a problem for the tax base because you were paying a lot in sales tax. So I don't know how we're going to work it out, but you put your finger on a big question.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on her question because, to put it in, I guess, more concrete terms, I get your question is, and if one of y'all can answer me, I appreciate it. You get federal government allocates $30 billion for Houston relief. Who gets the $30 billion check and who decides where the money's going? I think that's the way I interpreted your question.
Well, that's an easier question.
Okay, so what the answer is?
Because we have formulated
Okay.
regulations for both public assistance and individual assistance. It's all of these foundations that have raised to date, somewhere in the neighborhood of $250 million. That's $250,000. And so if you go and try and get on to see how do you apply for funds from the J.J. Watt Foundation, or how do you apply for funds from Rebuild Texas, which is what the Dell Foundation's put up, or how do you do all this other stuff? Yeah, miraculously, and this is a cynic to me, but miraculously, it's absent. When you go on J.J. Watt's foundation page, it's about rebuilding high school football team, or grade school and high school football team. There's nothing posted on there about how the money's going to be distributed. Now, in all fairness, what I think they're doing is they're going to people like Ron and saying, okay, look, how do we do this legally so that we don't get sued? There's a lot of that going on right now because you're talking about a lot of money. But if you look at Macondo, the BP incident, look how long it took them to distribute the funds to the people that were there. We're talking months and in some cases years. So you have to keep that.
And the person who makes that decision is what, the governor, the mayor, county judge, who makes that decision?
With Macondo, it was the individual assistance and public assistance is spelled out in the Stafford Act. So there wasn't a lot of private funds that were set out, but they were set, what private funds I know about were done by foundations with their own way, and then also Congress wrote some of the law that said how things would be distributed.
So a couple of words y'all used when you started. One was unity of effort, and the other one was King George. Moving forward to recovery, last week when the governor named the chancellor to be the head of recovery, my question is there already an organization underneath him that he's going to fall in and be in charge of? And the second one is, what's his relationship to that last diagram that you put up to control all of that federal stuff?
It's an entirely different deal. It's an entirely different deal. So this is my pitch. If I had legislators in the office, if I could speak to Congress on this issue, this would be my pitch. We really have had a lot of credit needs to go to the last two administrations over 16 years in what began from this big smoking mess. Now, it's not what you think I mean. This big smoking mess from the Twin Towers to today. A lot of credit needs to go to the way FEMA has been reorganized, to where places like TEACS have been funded, to what's happened at the local level. But we haven't seen that big change in the issue of recovery. So if you are an emergency manager of any town in the United States and you want to know how to build an emergency operations center, there's a FEMA publication that tells you what ought to be in one. CPG 101 will tell you what goes into it. It'll tell you how to put together an order, what annexes should be in there, what goes into the plan. If you need to do risk management, CPG 201 tells you how to fill out a risk, what goes in every block. There is nothing like that for recovery. There's not even a basic organization of what towns and cities ought to have. There's no checklist to say, is this operating, is this operating, is this operating? There is nothing like that because nobody is in charge of that. FEMA is not in charge of recoveries. They pay bills, they're not in charge. This is from the bottom up. And now I'm really about to get in trouble. If anybody has the blame for the fact that that hasn't happened, it's academia. We haven't studied that. We've not taken that on as a public policy issue. We have really not investigated that. And these emergency managers here, they don't have time for that. They're never going to look at that. And the State Highway Patrol and Bunker and Austin, they're never going to look at that. FEMA is not their job. So somebody's got to take that aboard and lay out the diagram so next time we have one of these, they say, okay, doesn't apply to us, doesn't apply to us, got to do that, yes, got to do that. There's nothing like that available.
I just want to add to what you're saying, Dave, because that diagram up there, as soon as we are fully engaged in recovery, and we're
Right.
kind of the middle point, that diagram is no longer.
All those guys go home.
It's no longer relevant. So it's really, the point that you bring out is very important. We've had the Disaster Research Center, University of Rhode Island, and all these other places that have looked at this, and we still don't have something we can lay our hand on.
And you know what the best news is? Nobody in this flood was radioactive. I'm telling you, buddy, this is coming. This is coming. And everybody's going to look at each other. Now, I thought we had 20, 30 years to get ready for this. So boats not showing up and trucks not showing up and hospitals are not taking people when you contaminate the emergency room. So
one here and two, and then those will be the last two, I'm afraid. Back there, go ahead.
At what point do we start resilient design for the next time this is going to happen? Where do we incorporate that, and then who leads the charge on that? Is that City of Houston? Is it Harris County? Is it the Corps of Engineers? All of the above? It's going to happen again, and the next one could be a direct hit. So how do we mitigate what happened this time?
Can I just amend that question and then see how they can answer? Going from what he does. You said, how do we prepare for this? Let's say in addition to the hurricane. He's referring to the terrorist attack. What about if the ship comes in the Houston Channel and blows up with a high explosive charge, and it's a dirty bomb, it's got radiation all over it? Okay? So now let's ask them who's preparing for both of them. I'll throw it on them. By the way, when he says academia is to blame, I saw this young lady nod her head. So I just want to let him know. All right, go ahead.
Okay, so let me give academia credit. The architecture department at Texas A&M has done a very good job of this. They have a group of people that have written on this. They're nationally known. They've published on this, and they are looking at resiliency and community and so forth. The problem is, not to get too arcane, but you're all students, the problem is this is an interdisciplinary study. And at a university, there's no daddy rabbit for an interdisciplinary study. And so that's been our problem for the last 20 years in the field of Homeland Security. There's no daddy rabbit for this study.
Question?
Yeah, comment, question. First, I'll say another way. I think there's a lot of opportunities for academia to contribute to it, and because there is a need for evidence base going forward for recovery. I was involved in Katrina response and recovery. It's our problem. And originally, we were hoping that the whole medical system in New Orleans could be recrafted to what's needed for modern day medicine. Instead, I think the political pressures locally, rebuilt the old system. Maybe we have an opportunity now in rebuilding Houston to get back to the resilient question. I think the challenges are going to be equally hard in the political pressures that we'll probably rebuild the old system. But I want your thoughts about that in a second. But go back to the recovery and the academic opportunity. I hope the evidence, we don't get forced into a solution that's a federal-only solution. Some things are best done at the community level. And I think that's where academia could really help a lot. And hopefully the evidence would come to that. Because it's amazing today, even in our response, how the public is almost demanding, and our politicians at the highest level are demanding this federal solution that's a local problem.
I think education is part of the deal. We the citizens, we all need to understand that the way the country runs, the federal government doesn't do everything. And that we need to keep preaching that over and over again. All disasters are local. The federal government says that in their document. I think the National Disaster Recovery Framework, that's the beginning of, probably the beginning of the effort of the federal government to try to provide some doctrine or some principles with which local and state government can start to work recovery like Dave's talking about. So, and that document only came out in 2011. So it's still floating around out there, and it's general principles is what it is, but it's a beginning. But there's definitely a lot of work to do.
So let me take the opportunity as a representative of a policy school to sell policy as an important issue. Okay. So a policy decision was made shortly after 9/11 that determines why we can't do in academia your very good, clear recommendation. The policy decision was that we would create centers of excellence within the academic community. They would be directed and funded out of the Directorate of Science and Technology within Department of Homeland Security. And all of the money for issues would go to that particular center. So what that did was mean if you're one of the 10 schools that's part of the START Center out of the University of Maryland, then you can get a grant to do terrorism studies. Every other school in America is frozen out of federal money. That's what it means. And so somewhere there's a school that's going to get, there's a center that's controlling the research money that's available from the federal government on these issues, but it's not us. And so to ask an academic to take his or her life and their possibility for tenure and focus it on a research issue where they can't get grant money because of a policy decision that was made 10 years ago is a serious issue. So you folks need to study policy issues and advise legislators better when you graduate.
All right, thank you so much for you joining me, giving our panelists a round of applause.